It's my pleasure to welcome Dan Hammermesh. Dan is a Susan Killian Professor at the University of Texas at Austin in economics, and he's a professor of labor economics at Maastricht University as well. So he has two professorships right now. I don't need to say a whole lot about Dan. He's a friend and colleague, and we're actually co-authors on papers that have been accepted in journals, including a few that have also been rejected in journals. So I think it's extremely appropriate that he's going to talk to us today about publishing. Dan got his A.E. from Chicago, and that explains some of his attitudes toward economics and life in general, but certainly not all of them. Dan is not a classic Chicago cut. He actually moderated a little bit at the Saltwater School, Yale University, taught at Princeton, and then went back to the freshwater of Michigan, sort of Michigan State, not exactly on the lake, but he's been in a lot of places and done a lot of things. He's written more than 100 refereed articles in his career. As you know, most of them are in labor economics, but I should mention some of his work has drifted into areas such as the academic labor market, the effectiveness of social programs, of course time use, and beauty and sleep. One of the most interesting articles I've ever read by Dan was an article with Biddle in 1990 in JP, looking at the way people allocate their time between sleep and non-sleep based on the economic value of that time. And of course, the famous article on suicide, which was rejuvenated recently in Avinash Dix's article on the option value of waiting. So sometimes Dan doesn't get the entire story. There's always the option value of waiting for the next article to get the next rejection letter to come in. So Dan is a fellow of the Metric Society, which is a great honor, of course, and he's also a very big wheel with the Society of Labor Economics, and he's also a fellow there. He's also a very important part of the Institute of Zukunft der Arbeit. He's published on, as I said, many things. One of his most important works, I think, is foundation of a lot of what we do is the book on labor demand, published in Princeton University Press in 1993. You may have seen him recently in the internet. He writes a blog for the New York Times. He was part of the Freakonomics blog, Levitt and Company, and he's of course a great teacher, as you'll see from his talk. He's won several awards. In fact, he's a Texas Twister, what do they call it? Texas something, some sort of blazer, Texas blazer, which is a very rare honor to have at the University of Texas. So without any further ado, Dan's going to talk to us about how to publish in a good journal, and I'm paying a lot of attention to that.
Okay, good. Just let me know if you can hear me on this. Okay, let's get this baby out of here. Okay. Michael didn't have it quite right. Well, it looks like I've published 100 refereed papers. Some of those are in journals that are refereed, but the papers aren't. So in fact, I keep a direct count for every 6 years of my career, of which I'm now this year starting the 8th, by the way. 8th 6-year period. There are exactly 80 papers, okay, that have been refereed. But, as Michael was hinting, most of them get rejected. In fact, whoever hooked up this logo here, this is wonderful. I got this last week from you, and I put it on the door of my office. That is the beautiful thing. Regrettably, I've submitted, I counted them, roughly 200 times to referee journals. There are 80 papers in referee journals. So you can see, every once in a while that's correct, but a lot of the times I hit there or further out, okay? In other words, they get rejected. It's especially germane today because, as Michael hinted, we had a paper that has been sitting in a journal for a very long time that got rejected today. So it's probably my fault, not his or the other co-author, but it's really very, very much on my mind today. And you'll see I'll talk about that a little bit, in fact. Let's close this now and blow this baby up. Okay, there we go. Control L. There we go. Okay. is how to publish in the top journal I wish I knew. And I trust the reason that you can see the second line here, I wish I knew, is illustrated by the fact that I still get rejected the majority of the time. I mean, 40–50% acceptance rates on papers. That's all. And even some of the stuff that I think is the best thing I've done. I started publishing in 1966, so I've been doing this for a very, very long time. Indeed, the only reason why I feel justified in talking about this stuff is I've been doing it for such a very, very long period of time. I had some experiences that maybe other people wouldn't have. Okay? So that's the reason for this paper, for this discussion. The purposes are to give you a few ideas about how to write papers better, how to deal with the profession, what to do, okay? How to pick topics, how to write them up, and so on. And, you know, it sounds very easy, and it's sort of like sex, and you're going to do it naturally anyway, but you might learn about it a little bit better by hearing others talk about it. And so that's the reason for this here. Okay? All right, first of all, what is a top journal? Well, I have a very, very high standard on this, and the profession as a whole does too. To me, a top journal, in my mind in economics, is there are 5, or maybe only 3 top journals. The AER, the Journal of Political Economy, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Econometrica, but that's not a general journal, it's a theory journal, really. And maybe the Review of Economic Studies. To me, those are top journals. And my guess is most economists are never going to publish them, but nonetheless, those are the ones to which one should be aiming. In the very top schools in both Europe and the US, and it's increasingly a world market, put the heaviest weight on those journals. And I'll talk about weights in a second. There are, however, specialized journals in each subfield. In labor economics, how many of you are labor economists? Okay, what's the top journal in labor economics? The Journal of Labor Economics. Thank you very much. I agree completely. Even though I edit one of the other ones, I'll admit Jolly is the top. There's no question in my mind. In public economics, anybody in public economics will admit it? The Journal of Public Economics is probably the top. I'm quite sure of that. In monetary economics, the Journal of Monetary Economics. Okay? Economists, I always thought we were unique in terms of weighing and ranking. I have a friend who's a psychology professor, chair of the psychology department. They do even more ranking and weighting than we do. I mean, we're not unusual in terms of our looking at our navels and weighing these things. There's nothing different about economists than everybody else. All fields in the social sciences do it, probably even in the sciences as well. So how are we going to decide how to rank these journals other than my arbitrary saying these are the top 3 or that's the top specialized journal as compared to anything else? There are a couple of ways I've seen. One is a paper by Stendos and several colleagues in the Journal of the European Economic Association in 2003, where they looked at the citations across journals and see which journals were cited most, which journals had papers that were cited most by people in publishing in other journals. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to do it. Another is perfectly arbitrary, but I think it's pretty right. This is the Handelsblatt ranking, okay? Which every March, people all know about the Handelsblatt ranking? Every March, the Handelsblatt, just for German economists, for economists based in the Deutschen Sprachgebiet, or for German economists elsewhere, they publish a lifetime ranking. In other words, all the things you've done, plus they also do the last 4 years ranking. Okay? And they do this in a very clever way, which includes giving weights for each journal. So they have 10 journals here, which they give a 1 weight to. And it includes the 5 I mentioned, plus a couple of finance journals. For some reason, the Journal of Monetary Economics, I don't know why. And then these general journals, which are covering lots of fields which nobody here would ever publish in, Nature and Science. Then they go down to a 0.6 ranking. There's Jolly, there's the JPubX. And you make Journal of Econometrics. Going further, they have a few others like my modal journal, the Restats. Then they go down to 0.3. And then they go down to, here's 0.2, the China Quarterly, the Canadian Journal of Economics. Here are the new AEA journals. My guess is those will wind up being weighted higher in the next year or two. And here we're down to 0.2. They go down to 0.05. In other words, I like this system. It's arbitrary. It's, I think, Professor Ursprung at Bodensee, whatever it is, Constance, Heinrich Ursprung, cooked this up. I don't think it's very bad. It has the virtue of saying, you know, it's not just all or nothing. And the world doesn't work all or nothing. But there are weights, and the weights seem to be, I think, fairly consistent with that. So I think that's quite reasonable. Okay? I don't know how the guy got this. It seems arbitrary, but it accords with my prejudices, so it must be right. Okay? Now look, it is very hard to publish in this business. As I said, I've turned down more often than not, and I've discovered that that's not atypical. It's funny, I don't know if any of you have colleagues who are in the hard sciences, like physics or chemistry. In my case, my father was a mathematical physicist. And I remember telling him I just got a paper rejected by a journal. And he said, looked at me as if I was a complete idiot. He said, you know, how could you do that? I said, Dad, in our field, you know, you're rejected most of the time. It turns out in physics, chemistry, the majority of papers that are submitted are published. In economics, and I discovered in the social sciences, it is not true. So what I've done here is collected data on acceptance rates at various journals in 2008. These are either from email exchanges with editors, where they did this for me, or in a few cases, the journal prints on its website or in the journal a list of its acceptance rates. And here's the AER, 7% chance of a paper being published there. This does not include the May issue, the Papers and Proceedings issue, which is a purely who you know. It doesn't count, it's not refereed. If you know somebody, they'll put you on a program and they might publish the paper. Econometrica, 9%. JPE, 5%. The QJE is the lowest of all. The editor was very proud to point this out to me. They're 4%. Okay? And the reason, of course, is very simple. First of all, there's no charge to submit there. There's no submission fee. And secondly, they'll turn down half the papers within a day or two. A desk reject. Indeed, I would give this paper a few months ago at Maastricht, this discussion a few months ago at Maastricht, and one person raised his hand and said he had his paper turned down before it was submitted. You might ask, how could you do that? And of course, it's real time versus nominal time. He submitted it from Europe, okay, and it was turned down within 4 hours. So it came back submitted before, it was rejected before submission. But in real time, it also happens. I had a student of mine on a Sunday at lunchtime submit a paper to the QJE. It was rejected at 3 p.m. Sunday. Okay? So they're very fast, and not surprisingly, if it's a low-cost submission, more people do it. They get a lot of them. Here's one, the Berkeley Electronic Press. People familiar with that? No? It's an online journal. They have 4 tiers. It's really quite neat. They have 4 tiers, and they'll put you either in the top, second, third, or fourth tier. So the first time I submitted there, I was convinced that they must publish everything, and I was rejected. So I figured this must be the worst paper ever. But in fact, as you can see, for any of their tiers, they only publish half of them. They have these tiers: frontiers, advances, contributions, and topics. Fact. It's a nice mnemonic device for that. And the top tier is like 1% of submissions. Even the second, the third tier is only 20%. So that's even hard. Economica, 11%. Michael Abbott was talking about that. The European Economic Review, 10%. Here's my journal, 18%. Jolly, 8%. These numbers are really low. What's really interesting is I did this exact same little survey for 2002. What's happened to these acceptance rates over those 6 years, do you think? Every single one went down. Every single one. And I was asking this editor of the Canadian journal over there why he thought this was. And he volunteered. What's happened is that the profession has widened. In other words, when I started out in economics, which is the mid-60s, it was an American/English profession. And over the last 30 years, until 10 years ago, it widened to be an American, English, and Northern European. It's now widened to be essentially a worldwide profession. So he said the CJE's acceptance rate has not fallen from submissions from the usual old sources. It's just they're getting more and more submissions from other places where people hadn't before submitted. But there's no question overall, these numbers are all falling. I was at a session a year ago with a bunch of editors, and I was talking to the guy who edits this journal, which is the AER equivalent for political science, and this journal, which is the AER equivalent for sociology. And look at their numbers, and compare them to the AER. Those numbers are the same. The same problem exists in the other social sciences as well. In other words, in social sciences, it is just really hard to publish in the top journals. So going back to the first page here, life is tough, okay? It is really hard to publish in this business, okay? And I'll give you some advice on how to cope with these difficulties. This is coping advice. First of all, though, what to work on. Where do you get your ideas from, okay? I've seen people who obviously get their ideas sort of like the birth of Athena from the head of Zeus. You know the story. She sprang full blown from the head of Zeus. You know, that's really good. That's really greatly original. I mean, Zeus cooked her up and now she popped, okay? The problem with cooking up ideas that way is that you run the danger that the idea is completely unrelated to anything anybody else cares about. Okay? So, remove from the mainstream. So I don't know, on the one hand that's a good way to get things, you're going to be original, on the other hand you've got to be sure somebody else might care about it. I know, for example, I spent 4 years on the American Economic Review Board. If you look at the AER, it says editorial board. You ever seen those names? It doesn't mean anything. You have no control over anything whatsoever. It sounds very good. All you do is referee a lot of papers. And one of your jobs is to referee papers that the editor wants comments on, which are completely out somewhere in left field. American baseball expression. Okay. Nobody cares about them. Would you please write a letter saying why this is not going to make it? Okay. And those are clearly papers that somebody just wasn't in tune with the profession on. He thought they were good, but they were just completely out. Another way of getting ideas is a neat bit of data. You see something in some data set and you say, gee, nobody's ever thought about that in an economic context. And clearly, some people do more of this than others. In my own case, that's been an awful lot of my career. The sleep data, the sleep paper that Michael alluded to, that arose because I saw in some data set information on sleep and I thought it'd be fun to work on. Same thing for the beauty papers, which has now been a third of my career for the last 15 years. Again, I saw some data on beauty. So there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you can do some original work on that. But again, might people care about it? Next, a reflection on the literature. Well, that's, you know, that ties you into what's going on in economics, but the problem is, of course, are you just being derivative of what has been done before? Still worse, should you write a reflection or comment on one paper? It's very easy for graduate students to do this. I didn't like something in this paper I read, I'm going to write a comment on it. Don't do that. Okay? When I was in the profession starting out in the 60s, the journals all had sections for comments, reply, and rejoinder. You remember this. If you notice, those have diminished like crazy. There's very little of that. And the reason is it's a pure example of the market working. Over the years, it became clear to editors that nobody wanted to read that rubbish and nobody commented on it. And it's a very nice study of this, that those comments and replies got many fewer references than did real papers per page. So why waste journal space publishing comments? And you shouldn't waste your time publishing comments. Okay? Don't write comments. Think of an idea, think how it may be linked to the literature. But a comment on a single paper, never. Never, ever, ever. The best topic is whatever interests you. I was talking with a grad student last week, who is not in labor, or she took labor, And she was interested in the topic, and one advisor said, well, why don't you do this? And she said to herself, that's really boring. She came to me, that's sort of an insult actually. She wrote to you, I need to talk to somebody more on the creative side. Is that a compliment? Or is it saying you can't do real economics, but you might think of something different? Anyway, she needed to keep herself amused for a year. If you're doing a dissertation, a PhD, you've got to convince yourself to keep going on it. It's a year or two of work. And therefore, you better be interested in what you're doing. That's the most important thing of all. Anything can be published somewhere eventually. We should keep that in mind with our own problem. Okay? But, you know, my comments to Michael are comments to myself also. I mean, I take every paper personally. They're like your children. And I love my children more than I love my papers. On the other hand, my papers need help, whereas my kids are 40 years old. They don't need my help anymore. So keep the profession in mind. In other words, do what interests you, but keep in mind the profession. And think how it fits in somewhere in some literature. Not as a comment, but how you're expanding knowledge, which after all, what we're told all along as scholars or scholars to be, that we're supposed to be doing. Should you co-author? Okay. Well, first of all, there's a wonderful bit of statistics on this. I did these data. I looked for 1963 in the top 3 journals in economics. What fraction of papers were co-authored? The answer was 15%. Okay. I did it for 2003, same journal. The fraction was 75%. I'd be happy to bet it's even higher now. Not only that, if you take the number of co-authors conditional on it being co-authored, the number of co-authors is going up. If you take the number of co-authors conditional on there being 3 or more, the conditional means going up. I didn't go beyond 3. So what's happened is the truncated mean of co-author numbers has kept on rising, rising, rising steadily. Okay? So should you co-author? We all do. I looked at my own record. I divided my career into 2 halves. The first half, 2/3 of my papers were single-authored. The last half, I'd like to think the second half, not the last half. The second half has been 2/3 co-authored, and the last 10 years, in fact, is almost all co-authored. I think I have 1, 2 refereed papers in the last 10 years that are single-authored. Not unusual. So why should you co-author? There are economies of scope. Your co-authors have skills that differ from yours. So, for example, Michael's a great co-author, okay, because he knows a lot of macro, which I don't. I don't even believe in it, but he's almost convinced me to believe in it. And maybe I add something to this partnership. I think I'm pretty good at grubbing micro data. That's my strong point. Okay? Secondly, it's fun. I mean, I co-author with a lot of people in Europe, co-author people in Australia, China, Europe, Israel. It's fun. It gets you travel abroad. It's fun to deal with people. Okay? And that's a pure consumption aspect. I'm convinced that's very important, by the way, not unusual. Mentoring, working with a person who's senior to you, might be of some value. Okay? Although, if you work with a person who's senior to you and publish a paper with them, I guarantee you they will get much more than their share of credit, and you will get much less. In fact, I will not work with very junior people at all, unless I absolutely have to, or it's a great idea. I have a paper coming out in a very good journal with 3 fresh PhDs, one of whom did nothing, which shouldn't be on there, by the way. There are 3 fresh PhDs. What's the order of authors on a paper? Who goes first in economics? How do we do that? What is it? Alphabetical. It's not like the sciences where the guy who owns the lab is either last or first. In this paper, my name is H. I would be first. I put my name last. I didn't want to have these guys look like I was my paper and they were my assistants. Nonetheless, I'm convinced people will see it and think, Hammermesh did another paper, and they won't get their full credit. Okay. Co-author with a senior person, you got problems doing it. You should really avoid it. Co-author with a colleague of the same vintage, good idea. You can take advantage of all these things. The other thing is, are there any extra rewards to co-authoring? Okay? This is a very interesting question. Now think about the market. In other words, if I have a two-authored paper, will it get the same awards, the same recognition as a one-authored paper? So if we're deciding how much to reward me, should I get half the credit as if the same paper were single-authored? Think about this one for a second. If you believe the answer on that is no, in other words, if I have a two-authored paper, I get 0.6 credit. Have I got a deal for you? Think about the game here. If it's a two-authored paper and each get 0.6 or 0.7 credit, and I'll give you examples of how that works, then I have a deal. I will put your name on my papers. If your papers of equal quality, have my name on yours. So if we write two papers, we'll each get 1.2 credits, whereas if we only had single author, we'd get 1 credit, right? I find it hard to believe that's an equilibrium. Nonetheless, there's a young economist, a professor of German origin, by the way, whom I know, who says he and another guy put each other's names on all their papers, because he's convinced the market works in this rather crazy way. And there's a lot of evidence it does. More and more schools, European schools especially, are now paying on a piece rate basis. You publish a paper, they give you a lump sum. Not in Germany, I don't think. But certainly the school in Prague, the Serge, anybody knows this operation? CERGE, they have an explicit system of bonuses where publishing in a certain set of journals will get, I think, 23,000 euros extra one time. And then 8,000 euros, and then 3,000 euros, and then divide by the inverse of the square root of the number of authors. So if you publish a two-authored paper, you get 0.7 credit, three-authored 0.5, four-authored 0.4. I find it very hard to believe that's the case, yet I'm convinced that what goes on in a large part of the profession, and it's getting worse as we pay more and more. I think there should be no extra rewards. I'm not so sure anymore that that's the case. So regarding co-authoring, do it, but try to avoid co-authoring with Michael, okay? Because he's going to get the credit, and you won't. Or Alexander, same problem, now that she's a senior person. Okay, how to write this up. And this is something I feel terribly strongly about because I edit a journal. I've been editing journals for 20 years, and I get an awful lot of very badly written up papers, which just drives me absolutely crazy. You should be able to ask yourself, what is the question that you were working on? Can you describe in 3 sentences, okay, to yourself or to your spouse, boyfriend, or girlfriend? Not you, Michael. Your wife's an economist. This is no trick for her to understand what you're doing. Can you describe to a smart 15-year-old what you're doing? Okay. In less than or equal to 2 sentences. Okay. Can you summarize it for yourself? This is not an original idea with me, by the way. Paul Samuelson said this. The grandmother, well, no, I don't, yeah, I wouldn't, my grandmother's, no. They had 8th grade educations. No. My wife's a grandmother, so if you describe it to her and she doesn't understand it, you got a problem. Okay? I see too often people will simply describe their project by saying, well, Professor X did this, Professor Y did this, and I've done that. That is not a description of a project. Okay? What is the single question you were trying to answer? Very, very simple. That's all there is. So what this is novelty upon a base. What is new in these 2 sentences that might be related to what people have done before? If you can't answer that question yourself, then you aren't thinking straight about what you're doing. Okay, the title of a paper. I mean, you know, you walk along the street and see somebody, the first thing you notice is how they look. People aren't going to read your paper right away. You've got to entice them into reading it. So, differentiate your product. Make it clear in the title why yours is different. Summarize the main points. Grab the reader's attention. Triplets. In Latin, Western European languages, we like threes. Maybe that's because of the Trinity, appropriate enough here. I don't quite know why, but we like to do things in threes. My first paper in a major journal, in a top 3 journal, it's called, I'm sure Michael's very familiar with this paper, it's a macro paper. It's called Wage Bargains, comma, Threshold Effects, comma. You've never read this. Why? I think you have too much time on your hands. Anyway, it's called Wage Bargains, comma, Threshold Effects and the Phillips Curve. You can see by the title it must be really old because nobody even mentioned the Phillips Curve these days. But it was 3 things. We like 3 things. A short description of a phenomenon is another way of doing it. Picking unusual words. And this is in some sense an unfair advantage for English speakers because we write our papers in English and we know more unusual words. It's a man named Saul Polacek. People may know him. He had one paper called The Perspicacious Peregrinator, which is a really good title. Peregrinator, that's just a Latin word for moving around, migrating. Perspicacious means clever. Okay? Good title. Bad kind of question. You always have a question in the title is also really cool, by the way. Having a question mark at the end is a good thing. Bad things. Something, colon, the case of some country. So, some title and then colon, the case of Germany. Boy, is that a turn-off. Because it means to me you're replicating what's been done elsewhere. Very bad. Okay. And pick your phenomenon in country X. The such and such in Germany. Why is that bad? Because it means you've isolated to a very specific thing. You've already said your idea is not general. It's nothing wrong with using German data or any other country's data to illustrate an idea. But by writing a title like that, you made it clear this is a very narrow thing, country-specific. A note on whatever phenomenon you want. A note on that already tells me it's trivial. Don't do that. Being boring, that's the worst thing you can do with a title. So here are 6 examples of good titles that I've dreaded up from reading over the last 45 years. This is a paper I'm sure nobody has seen. It's a truly wonderful paper. It was written right after World War II. I'm learning not to say the war anymore since nobody knows which one we're talking about. These days it could be any one of our American phenomena. This is the Economic Organization of Prisoner of War Camp. This guy was a prisoner of war. Anybody ever seen this paper or read it? You have. Why? Okay. I wonder why anybody would do this, but it's a great paper because he describes how an economy grew up from nothing, and all the exchanges took place, and what became money. Even Michael didn't know this paper, did you? I think you do. It was anthologized in various books later on, but that's where I read it in graduate school. It was assigned, believe it or not, in the theory class, which probably wouldn't happen today. Wonderful paper. And you know, that title really grabs you. Here is the longest paper ever published in the American Economic Review, 70 pages long, called Jumping the Gun, which in professional sports, it means you go off before the starting run goes. Okay? And it's a really clever title for one of the truly great papers I've ever read in my life, which I teach in various classes. Here's my contribution. The paper in the Restats 3 years ago. Stressed out on 4 continents, time crunch or yuppie fetch. Okay? Fetch in Yiddish means to complain. Yuppie, people know what a yuppie is. Okay? These are cool words, and it has a good question out there. I'm proud of that one. Here's a paper, which is, I read this my first year in grad school, The Peculiar Economics of Organized Sports. By saying peculiar, the author draws you in. What's peculiar about organized sports economically? So, that's a good one. This one, just as a prurient interest, gender differences in mate selection, evidence from a speed dating experiment. Okay? It happens to be, in my view, a really bad paper, just a badly done paper, but the title is really cool. Here's one, recent QJE, the church versus the mall. Isn't that a winner? It's about what happens when religious phases. It has to do with actually stuff very much like your Blue Lord stuff, Michael. Okay? What happens when religion faces increased secular competition? Just a very simple look across American states at what happens to church attendance when laws are changed. Anyway, those are good titles. These are bad titles. My guess is you can do better than what you have. All right, an outline for an empirical paper. I have no idea how to tell you how to write an outline from a theoretical paper, because I've written 2 theoretical papers in my life. Neither of them very important. Okay? You want to read how to write a theoretical paper. There's a wonderful book by William Thompson, Thomson. Anybody know this book? Check it out. William Thompson, Thomson. It came out in about 2003. This guy's a theorist at the University of Rochester. It's how to write English well in a theory paper, how to write it up. He happens to be French. He's a native Frenchman, French speaker, with a heavy accent speaking English, but he writes beautifully. This is just a great fun book to read. So I can't help you on that. I can maybe help you on an empirical paper. Typical outline, introduction, theory. I don't know, I never put theory anymore. I put theoretical basis. Because for me to say theory would be very pretentious. And my guess that'd be true for most of you also. Because most of you don't do theory. Data, results, tests or implications of results, conclusions or implications. Okay? That's a typical format in economics. By the way, if you read other fields, sociology, psychology, the papers do not look like this at all. They look quite a bit different. But this is what we do typically. Introduction. This is not a literature review. I have students, every year some student says, well, I'm working on the lit review for my dissertation. What do you think of it? And my response is one word, don't. Don't do a literature review. Okay? Doesn't mean you shouldn't know what's going on, but I don't want to see a write-up of all the things you happen to have read or you think are relevant. You cite them in ways that motivate what you are doing. It shows you've read stuff, it shows your link to scholarship, but nobody wants to read your summary of what other people have done. We don't do that in this business. Never review them. No lit review anywhere. The cited papers fit in as an illustration. The introduction should also be a statement of the problem. What the question is you're dealing with, where it comes from, and why it's important. And by the way, you're just scratching your neck, which is fine. Okay, back there. I'm happy to have questions in the middle, darn it. Okay, I hate to get up here like a performing seal and perform for an hour and a half. So anytime you raise your hand, please feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, or tell me you think I'm just crazy, which is the usual response I get. Okay? Theory section is to show something new. It's not like a cadenza in a concerto. Anybody play instruments like violin or piano? Clarinet? Oboe? Flute? In the concerto, toward the end of the first movement, and usually the third also, really the second, there's a solo part which you're supposed to play, either written by the composer or you make up your own, which is not very common, okay, to show your virtuosity. This section should not be a cadenza that shows your virtuosity. It's not its purpose to show that you can do theory. The purpose, or to repeat others, is to derive or motivate your empirical work. If you're doing an empirical paper, the only reason for a theoretical section is to motivate your work and to clarify the idea in your mind and the reader's minds. That's the purpose for doing theory in an empirical paper. No, I don't. No. I think that's the foreshadowing. I don't like that. Okay. On the other hand, I have trouble writing long papers. And a lot of the reason papers are long is that people say the same thing 3 times. I have great trouble doing that. But I don't want, look. I mean, if it's a striptease, they don't go in and take off all their clothes all at once. They entice you in with a whole bunch of exciting things. So why have the striptease right at the start? Okay? Tease the reader, invite them in, tell them why you're doing this. That's my answer anyway. Data. I get so many papers where people will go on at great length about what the PSIE is, or the NLSY, or the ZUB. Nobody needs to know what the ZUB is. There have been thousands of papers written using it. Even American readers don't need to know what the ZUB is. We know about it. if we're in the labor field. So please don't do that. On the other hand, if you're using some interesting data, talk about it. If you create your own data, which is an increasingly common phenomenon in economics, it used to be very rare, now it's quite common. Say how you got them, how you put things together. I would also include in this section descriptive statistics, means, variances, in a data section. Oftentimes the reason is very simple. You can massage data from now till next year, but the simple differences in means will show very clearly what your result is. And indeed, quite frankly, there are a number of people, older people like myself probably, but maybe some younger ones, who say, if the difference isn't there in the means, I really wonder how much of a difference there is. In other words, is there really anything going on here? So putting a table of the statistics right there, I think, is a very good idea. Results. Okay. I get more PhD students who spend all the time writing up their theory, writing up the data, and here's my tables, and here's my conclusion. 2 pages of tables of talk, 15 tables, and then the conclusion. That's not analyzing anything. I want you to tell me why and what, and spend a lot of time. Sorry for the sexual reference again, ladies or men. Unlike sex, foreplay shouldn't be most of the duration. The results must be discussed at length. Okay? Absolutely. I don't know if your students, Michael, all have the same problem as mine on this. Maybe you've taught them better or they come here with better skills than ours. But this is a constant problem. After all the work to get the data and run the regressions, the tables are thrown at you and they're done. Does that happen here ever too? I see some guilty faces here, so it probably does. Okay? All right. Stress and discuss the original. Spend no time on standard results. Let me show you that. This is the paper that Michael mentioned that was in the JPE on sleep. Here's table 3. It's a regression on sleep and nap time. Has a bunch of characteristics. Okay. Work time, married, years married, age squared, years of schooling, male, excellent health, kids, Protestant. Okay. That's evangelical. Okay. And then I want to use the same dependent variable to look at a few different things. Notice, these are the same regressions, includes all the variables listed in table 3. I didn't bother listing the coefficients for all the rest of the variables because I had demonstrated their effect and didn't care about them anymore. Here's another example. This is stress in Germany, time stress in Germany. The left-hand side variable is whether you are stressed always or often. So it's yes, you're stressed always or often. And here is a bunch of variables I was interested in. Hours of work, days work, shopping, caring for kids, health, and income, which of course was the crucial variable in my project. There were all kinds of other things. East Germany, big city, self-employed, married versus cohabiting, age of kid, number of kids, spouse, blah, 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 blah. I didn't care about those. The theoretical motivation was on these variables up here, and I didn't bother wasting the reader's time or the journal space talking about all the rest. So again, stress the important. In a dissertation, throw it all in, because nobody cares. It's going to be buried in the library. But in an article, leave the excess out. Okay. Link the results back to your theoretical derivation. In other words, why do these results make sense? Why did I expect them? Or maybe I didn't expect them, in which case, boy, is that cool. Okay. Next, tests and implications. These days, what is the title of this section in the typical paper? It's called robustness checks. It's really quite interesting, by the way. If you look at the length of papers published in journals these days, they're getting longer and longer and longer. I don't know, I just picked up, was it the latest JPE? There is one paper that's 25 pages, all the others are 50 plus. The AER, bless its heart, has now put a limit on length of papers. Absolutely, and they're trying to enforce it. You send a paper there, it can't be more than 50 pages of typescript. The Quarterly Journal of Economics, 50 pages in print is the median length. Why is that so? Because these robustness checks. are filling up the journals. Why does that happen? Because some referee says, why don't you try this? Or you give the paper and say, why don't you try this? So you put it in your paper. This really bothers me. I mean, nobody needs to see everything you've done. Put it in a footnote, unless it's really important, or put it on the web, on a web-based version of the paper. You say you did it, but nobody needs to read all about it. I'd be embarrassed to put in some of the things the referees want me to put in. I do it because I want to get published. I mean, if the editor says, we'll publish this paper if you tell me the sky is pink with red polka dots, hell, I'll write the sky is pink with red polka dots. But it doesn't mean I believe it. The journals are full of things just like that. In this section, I would also talk about how the results might be useful. Okay. Simulating policy, interesting phenomena, or explicit applications. In other words, tell me why what you found out might concern me. The conclusion. I know about you, but my guess is some of you write papers where the conclusion is not a conclusion, it's a summary. A conclusion is not a summary. So if you write a conclusion that's a summary, I will tell you add at least one paragraph that goes about where this paper might go, why it's relevant. In other words, how people might use this for doing their own work in the future. The main point is, it's not a summary, it's not a rehash. When I was going to graduate school, people were told that you had to talk about the policy implications of your research. Now maybe they just don't care anymore, but that became a very artificial sort of thing. You had to think of some way your research was policy relevant. Okay? Now most of what we do, that's a pretty large leap to say it's policy relevant. I mean, for example, I think of my papers on beauty. Is that policy relevant? Well, yeah, it is, but it's a large jump to get there. It's taken me 15 years to see why it's policy relevant. And we stopped doing that. So you don't have to think about policy when you do your work or write your papers. Don't waste your time. It's embarrassing. The abstract. Again, the first thing people see is the title, right? But typically on the front page there's also an abstract, and I always read all the abstracts. Yeah, that's not true. I get 5 papers a day from the IZA, right? You all get the IZA list? And I read the titles. I don't even read the abstracts. If the title looks slightly interesting, I'll then read the abstract, right? And if the abstract's really interesting, I'll read the paper and see if I want to spend my time on it. So the abstract's really important, but do it after you've written the paper. I often thought of writing it beforehand, and I say, no, I don't know what I'm going to say. The abstract should not be a paragraph that's from the introduction or the conclusion. Because the conclusion concludes, introduction introduces, the abstract summarizes everything. Summarize what you did, theoretical if there is anything, and empirical, also telling me what your data are. So that's pretty straightforward. Using the Z. That's 3 words in the abstract. That's all you need. Okay? You should grab the reader again. Also, most journals, when you get to submit a paper, will eventually say there's 100 or 150 or 200 word limit. Isn't that right? How many have submitted papers ever in your careers yet? Okay. There's a limit, right? Hard to meet. Don't fool around with it. They say 100 words, damn it, it's 100 words. This is why we have Microsoft Word properties. Copy your abstract over, put it in a separate file, count the words, and then start cutting and cutting and cutting. Okay? And with a little bit of effort, you can get it down to 100 words. It's amazing how easy it is to do that, to get rid of excess words without losing very much. Stick to the space limitations. Not initially at submitting, but eventually. Here's an alternative to the standard outline for an empirical paper. And I've done this a few times. In other words, put the data and results before the theory. Here's some data, and there's an interesting empirical result that comes up. How can we rationalize this empirical result? That sleep paper had some simple facts about sleep. Saying, how can this come about? And then we had a little bit of theory, like the time-use model, the utility maximizer, and then more complicated results. Paper I wanted to give this week, but nobody much is around on immigration and time use. We have a couple of very deep results, which is crystal clear in the means. Then we have some theory to explain it. It's a very cute theory, if I may say so myself. And then a lot of fancy empirical testing, fancy models, and very cute econometrics. So, data and results can motivate the theory, but again, is the theory really necessary? Does it tell us anything new? I like to think that in the 2 papers where I've done this approach, it does. You know, I may be deluding myself. No literature review. You've heard that already, right? But a little repetition doesn't hurt. Anyway, that's how I write up a paper. The next thing I get into is probably even more depressing, especially to non-English speaking natives. Are there any English speaking natives in the room other than Michael? Okay. How many of you are German? Raise your hand. How many other European? How many non-European? Okay. Asians? Okay. This is relevant for everybody, but everybody has their own problems with my language. Okay? English is easy at one level. I think one of the reasons is not just American hegemony. One of the reasons English is taken over, it's very easy to get by in English. Look, there's almost no grammar. The only languages I know which have less grammar are Indonesian. If anybody studied Indonesian, isn't it wonderful? It's great, but it's also hard as the devil to do it well. But it's really easy to get by on the street, as I discovered in my 7 weeks in Java a number of years ago. Hebrew is not so hard either to get by. Turns out there are very few cases, not too many declensions. German is very hard, in some sense, to speak properly. But once you learn the rules, you know, you got it down. It's an absolute pleasure. Russian, any Russian speakers? It's really hard to learn Russian. I had 2 years in university. I gave up with the 2 different verb forms, the aspects of verbs. Every infinitive has 2 forms in Russian, right? Отвечать, ответить, right? Answer, отвечать, ответить is another 2 forms. My accent's loud, okay? It's close, okay. There are 2 verb forms, and I can never get it straight. But again, once you learn all the verb forms, and it has 6 cases, not 4, the instrumental and the prepositional, as well as your 4 in German, it's, you know, you got it down. English, there are no rules, and that's what makes it hard. It's all feel. So we'll talk about that. It matters because readers' time is scarce. If you write something up really badly, I get sick of it and I say, look, not only can this person not write, but his mind is so confused he can't think straight either. So I'll infer from bad writing that there's substantive problems as well. That's why it's important. It's not just to do it right for its own sake. It's to do it right so people think you're saying something sensible. So there are various levels of problems. The lowest level is the writing is so bad that the person reading it can't figure out what the devil it is you're doing. In other words, it's just complete nonsense. Next level, left out, subject-verb, incorrect the pluralization in possessives or subject-verb disagreements. Okay. So a singular subject, a plural verb. This would never happen in German. I mean, it's unthinkable if you know German well. Next level, left out articles. No the or a. We see this all the time. It's a severe problem for Asians and for Russians, where there's no articles either. Okay? Incorrect prepositions. This is where Western European economists fall down, because the words sound the same in German as in English. On, by. On is really a tough one. It ain't the same in English. And you see these all the time wrong. Incorrect gerunds and participial phrases, ing words are wrong all the time. Is this correct, Michael? I mean, you must deal with this constantly. You know, and you're an educated man, much better than me. It must drive you nuts. It really worries me. Let's have some illustrations here. If I can blow this up, how do you blow up? Control plus, of course, right. The question is always, where's the plus on a German keyboard, darn it? It's got to be a plus, I know there is. No, it's not an iPhone. Do it. There it is, there it is, there it is.
Yeah, but it's not working.
Okay. Now try Control plus. Yeah, Okay, let's just do it up there. There we go. Okay, here we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, here we go. So here is one. I have this thing circled here. According to our results, EPL coverage reduces the dismissal rate only establishments above 10 employees, being the estimated effect for establishment below 15 employees statistically significant but smaller than. Read that sentence. If you can figure out what that means, your English is much better than mine. I have a vague notion of this, but I really had trouble telling what this person was trying to get across, and it really turned me off not reading the rest of the paper. Here's another one. This is not as bad. This is the next level of problem. Employer is absent from the retirement model. Now you can do this two ways. Solution one, the employer is absent from the retirement model, or solution two, employers are absent. I would probably use solution two, because there's probably more than one employer in the world you're talking about. I'd say employers are absent. Here's one which I think again is close to making no sense. The effect of tunnel eligibility is rather small. Workers who are eligible to the tunnel. What does that mean? They can go under the river or what? I have no idea what the person is talking about. Very, very disturbing. Okay. So again, problems here. Here is one which is just bad grammar, and you see this in English among Americans and English. The collectors of the data graded each task's difficulty. What's the problem there? Yes, the gentleman back there points out he needs an apostrophe. Task is plural. It should be T-A-S-K-S apostrophe S. It's possessive. Well, that's a mistake. It didn't turn me off in the paper, but it was just wrong. Here's one which is more subtle. This gets to the lowest level. A number of considerations suggest to use caution. What's wrong with that? Suggest using caution. This is really hard for other Western European speakers because in other languages you would use the infinitive form. But in English you don't. You use this crazy form we have. If you spoke this, I know what you mean, but it's really wrong grammar. Down below, this is even a common one. Mainly due to availability reasons, the data I use is at the aggregate. What's wrong with that? You mean all you need is Latin for that. What's the problem? Data is plural. Datum is singular. Okay. The data are at the aggregate, and even at the aggregate isn't right. The data are at the aggregate level would be better, or the data are aggregated. Okay. Again, these are much more subtle points. Yeah?
I understand this is quite a problem of PDA. So Americans would relatively often use data is.
I know, but it's just bad grammar. We're illiterate. That's all I'm saying. It's well known. Oh, maybe I'm old. I understand what you're saying. Maybe it's that I'm old. Maybe it's that my mother was an English teacher. I never took Latin. Okay, but you know, datum is a singular. Data is a plural. Okay, and these are Latin words. Our language comes partly from Latin. So I don't know, this is a minor point. I know what you do, and you're right, people do it, but it's bad grammar. There's no question about it. Here is one. This is a really tough one. The Finnish unemployment benefit system provides extended unemployment benefits for the workers who lose their job. This is sort of like a quiz, an English test. Well, first of all, I wouldn't use the there. This sounds better. If workers who lose is better than the worker who lose. It's very hard to say why that's correct, but if you're a native English speaker, I know you would write that way. And here, lose their job. What's wrong with that? Yeah, well, they don't all have the same job, right? It can be very hard. It should be one-to-one, right? So it should be their jobs. That's a bigger problem. Again, these aren't major, but I urge you, don't make these mistakes. There's another one. It's, however difficult. What's wrong with that? Each comma's after before however. To see which variables this might be. Not this, these. Variables is plural. These should be plural. One way to partly solve this I don't know. Michael thinks I'm being very picky. Split infinitives. In English, to me, to old people like Michael now too, who are educated well, it's a mortal sin to split your infinitives. You don't... How many of you are familiar with the old Star Trek with William Shatner? Remember that? Okay. What's the line at the start of Star Trek? To boldly go where no man has gone before. That's bad grammar. It should be to go boldly where no man has gone before. Okay? But nobody cares too much, so I wouldn't worry much about this. But you know, if you're learning a language, why not do it right rather than wrong? This one is one of my favorites. We find that treated mothers have a 4.9 percentage points higher probability to get an additional child. That's a sign I know the person is not an English speaker. You don't get children, okay? I mean, I remember I was talking to one of my granddaughters 10 days ago about where her brothers came from. And she said, well, we got them both at the baby store, okay? She was joking. She's pretty much aware of how these things work. You don't get children. You have children. So this is one, I don't know why I like this so much, but it's just wrong in such a pretty way. Well, I am. My wife thinks I am. There we go. So, what you can do about this, write something up, and before you send it to a journal, don't just rely on Microsoft Word's red, okay? Your Microsoft Word, they have little red things, you know, where you make a mistake. That's not very good. It catches spelling errors sometimes, but it sure doesn't catch grammar or usage errors. Get an English speaker to read it carefully for you. Not your friend who's also from a German university, but an English speaker. And I say carefully, very, very clearly carefully. One of my PhD students a few years ago, a Turkish woman, I told her, look, this writing is not satisfactory to me. She's got to get it read. Her husband was American, and she said, I'll have my husband read it. It came back, I swear it was worse written than it was before. The guy couldn't write. He obviously hadn't spent much time on it, he wasn't very careful. So be careful. One other thing I would do, believe it or not, after I've been sending papers off to journals since 1965, I still do this. Before I send the paper to a journal, I read it word for word. Not like that, but every word. Self-vocalizing, but I read every word to make sure it's correct. Because if you know the language well, which most of you now do fairly well, you write too fast, and you certainly read too fast, and you'll miss mistakes. Word for word. Have your spouse or partner read it. This is a great thing. I mean, my wife still reads about half my papers. And if they're papers that have all semi-popular things, she reads them all. Especially the intro and conclusions, which are not going to be technical. Have your spouse read it, because they'll catch mistakes and they'll catch whether the whole idea makes any sense. I'm not sure this next thing is important in Europe or not. But you know, Michael knows this at least as well as I, our business ought to influence the real world. I went into economics. I chose economics as my college study when I started university in 1961 for two reasons. One, I liked the fact it was mathematical even then. And two, I thought I could influence the world. There's nothing else like economics, where you can both do something precise. It's not baloney like sociology, because there are sociologists here. And it's not mathematics, which is by itself. It's precise, but with real world importance. And we have things to say about the real world. And it's important to get them out. So I would try to get publicity. Does Humboldt have a public relations office? Of course it does. And they're always looking to publicize your research. They love it. They make their living off it. But by helping them publicize research, you're helping yourself. You're getting your ideas out there in the world. It helps the university. The head of the faculty loves it. It also makes you useful. And finally, most important to younger researchers, getting your ideas out, explained to the public relations person, means you can explain them in simple terms that make sense. I think this is absolutely important, and economists don't do enough of this. There's no payoff in the profession to it, but there is a payoff in terms of our being useful. Okay, what should you do after you've written the paper? Present the paper any chance you get, and it's especially true for young people. Don't be embarrassed about going to, I don't know, what's a low-level meeting that you might go to? I don't know. The Southwest Economic Association. There is such an animal, by the way. I'm sure nobody's going to go there. But you get to go to the Verein für Sozialpolitik, for example, or the EEA, or Seoul Aali meeting, for example. Any chance you get. Because the problem is that people will not read your papers. You can send your paper to 30 people, and if one of them comments, you're very lucky. But if you go to a meeting and present it, people will have to comment on it, at least one person. So get on programs. It's also the best way to understand what you know what's going on. When is a paper ready for a journal? This is a very hard question. On the one hand, you can always make it better, right? One more draft, one more presentation, one more discussion with your advisor. That's a pro. You can get more comments, do better. On the other hand, I'm absolutely convinced that the more times I give the paper, the lower the marginal value of the comments I receive. Because the best comments will come the first time and I'll revise it. Okay? So diminishing returns on that very clearly. Also, I think the real problem is that there are people in this profession who I know who just continually believe they can make it better and perfect the paper. Let me tell you, there is no such thing as a perfect paper. It's never going to be perfect. Okay? You can keep on fiddling and fine-tuning. That's not going to matter. You're just wasting your time. And you eventually get to a point where you're so convinced it has to be perfect that you can't do anything. And I know enough people in this profession like that. Another problem, which I think is important, is if you wait long enough, there's a very good chance that somebody else will do almost the same thing, in which case your paper is worthless. So there's a right time. My feeling is that third draft. These days it's easy to revise papers. You know, just cut and paste in Word is easy enough. So typically a paper, in my view, should be at least the third draft. In my case, I try to do the third and the fourth draft, go off to a journal. Off to the journal. Which journal? What students always do is they make autoregressive forecasts. They take the journals and see what they're publishing and say, gee, they're interested in this topic. I should send my paper there. Is that right? Students who've submitted? The problem with that is editors also get bored after a while. At this point, at the ILR review, almost any immigration paper I get on assimilation of something or other, I say, we've had enough of these, don't waste my time. I don't say that. What I say is, it's an interesting paper, it looks really correct, but we have a lot of papers. I would suggest you send it to another journal. And rather than getting you 2 referee reports, which will take me 6 months, I realize your time is valuable and you want to get published, please submit elsewhere. I don't even have a form letter. I just make this thing up the same way each time. I mean, I know what I want. Minimum wage is another one. I don't want to see minimum wage papers. I'm sick of that. So be careful on that. Editors get tired. What they do like in journals is that they have traditions. Certain journals have worked on certain things over the years. If you have a paper that goes back to what journals did many years ago, which they haven't dealt with recently, that's a cool way of deciding where to send something, sort of reintroducing a subject. Journal style. The QJ has a style. Find an instrument. Okay? The Reese does has a style. Fancy structural models or fancy econometrics. This helps you to know what the editors are interested in, just by looking at what they've done, what they work on. Because I can't stress enough how important editor discretion is. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Next thing is an honest evaluation of your own paper. Okay? The way I phrase it is, not all babies can become president of the United States. Not all your papers will be published in the American Economic Review, regrettably. Nonetheless, absolutely important, don't undersell your paper. In other words, aim high at the start. Higher than you might think. Where was it? Just last week, someone, was a student or a young colleague, a student came in, and she wanted to know, I was a visitor, wanted to know where to send the paper. I said, well, Journal of Public Economics. He said, really? That's a pretty good journal. I was thinking lower. I said, look, they probably won't take it. But you know, they might. It's the right topic. It's on taxation. Here's a little new idea. Try it. I mean, you know, you've got time to search elsewhere. But don't start too low. It pays to aim high. Because you saw at the start, the profession rewards differently. One thing you should do is when you have a paper and you send it off, is have what I call a submission tree in mind. I know that I'm trying this journal, and if it's turned down, I will revise it and try this journal next. I know what my tree looks like. And the problem eventually becomes, if it's turned down often enough, you're at the end of the branch, and you figure you either jump into space or build a new tree. That's a problem. But have a submission tree in mind. Yes? We'll talk about, in other words, when to pull the plug, as I'll talk about. We'll get to that a little bit later, okay? What's scarce in journals? There are two things that are scarce, or three. Refereeing time of good referees. These days, about 25 to 30% of my requests for referees are either never answered or the guy says I'm too busy. And I gather from people who've been refereeing for a long time that this fraction has been rising steadily. Again, you can't tell by your own experience, you or I, because as you get busier as a paper on this, you referee less and less, you turn down more and more. But secularly, there's been an increase. Journal space is scarce. Most important, the editor's time is scarce. It's the editor who controls the journal. And so that's what's going on here. What's being maximized, we're doing this economically. Here are the constraints, here's the maximum. The maximum is journal fame or visibility. How many people read it? How many people cite the paper? How much additional research is generated by the papers published in this journal? That's the point of the realm. Should you submit to the same journal where you published recently? If you published there? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, if it's the right journal, yes. On the other hand, if you publish in the same journal again and again, people think, aha, it must be the editor is a good friend of his to publish anything he writes. So it's a real trade-off. But the main thing is it the right journal for that paper? How about having two papers at the same place? There's an issue of the AER where one scholar I know has 3 papers in the same issue. Okay, Jim Andreoni. Very good guy. They're all co-authored, though. So it's not like it's all his own work. And for that reason, given the ubiquity of co-authorship, I see no reason not to have 2 papers. If they're the right journal, send it there. And editors don't mind. How long should the paper be? Well, I talked about this. I put more and more stuff in an appendix. Okay? And as I said, more and more journals are having limits on that. How do you submit a paper? One-sided. Well, that's no problem these days because the papers aren't in paper. They're all electronic. Okay? Normal fonts. Don't play games with little print. I've seen that happen too. Especially these days if they can do a word count. And most important for you Europeans, damn it, double-space the paper. Europeans write these single-space papers, right? And I don't know, maybe it's my vision is going because I'm old, although I can see pretty well. They write these single-space papers and it's most annoying to read it. Okay? I just write a double-space. I think that journals don't require that, but it makes life so much easier for the reviewers and the editors. Please do that. Hearing from the journal, we saw how slim the chances are. And believe me, as I discover all too often, rejection doesn't get any easier the older you get. You'd think that having been used to rejection, the marginal rejection would have very little damaging effect on one's psyche. I can assure you, as I discovered today, that it bothers you just as much as it did the first time I rejected was 1967, 43 years ago. It doesn't matter as much, but psychologically it's just as bad. Let me ask you, when you were a kid, a child, do you ever have these toys, like about 1 meter tall, blow-up toy, which was heavy on the bottom, like a clown face, and you punch it, and it bounces back up. That's the way you have to be in this business, okay? Because you're being punched and knocked down continually. And you got to bounce back up and say, I think what I've done is good. I'm going to try elsewhere. You got to do that again and again and again. Outright acceptances are very rare. In my career, out of 80 refereed paper, 2 of them, only 2 did I get letters that said, we'll publish this if you make these small changes. 2 times out of 80 acceptances. It just doesn't happen. The one thing you should be careful about is not to assume that what looks like a rejection is a rejection. As an editor, I will never accept a paper until it's actually in perfect form. But I'll send letters like, if you do this, I'd be willing to reconsider it. Called a revise and resubmit or an R&R. These days, that's all you get. My rule in general is, unless they kick you in the knee and slam the door in your face, you resubmitted a journal. Only once in my career have I failed to resubmit when they didn't slam the door in my face. I think I was correct then, but even so, I'm not so sure in retrospect. But unless they say no, 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 and when I say no, I'll say it 3 different ways in the rejection letter, just to make sure they understand. This tells you what to do about rejections or almost rejections. This paper called A Young Person's Guide to the Economic Session, which I recommend to all of you. Should you complain about a rejection? I've complained twice in over 100 rejections. One of them, the first one, was 1982. I had only 1 referee report. The referee spent 7 pages, of which 5 were on the theoretical part, which was unimportant. And the 2 pages on the empirical part were just wrong. I complained to the editor. I said, look, this is just not a good report. I'd be grateful if you get another 1 or 2, which he did, and they published it. The AAR. Okay. The second time was 1997. They had 2 reports. They seemed positive to me. And the editor was a very old friend, now deceased, said, Dan, we've published several of your papers before. Forget about it. I mean, just like that. Okay. I had just last week, I rejected a paper, not talking about the writer, 2 recent negative experiences. These are young people. This was the quarterly journal. This co-author of mine got 3 reports. 2 of them seemed positive. He complained to the editor. The complaint was shot down in 6 hours flat. The editor said the paper's just not good enough. Another one, a student of mine, went through 3 rounds of resubmission at a journal. 7 different referees, and was turned down when the editor changed. Which is really a sad story. The journal should not have changed editors. You don't change editors. Once you handle a paper, the editor should continue. He wrote back to the new editor. The new editor said, I don't like the paper, I'm sorry. That's just not fair, frankly. But what could he do? Don't complain. It's just not worth it because you don't know what the referee has told the editor or what the editor cares about. All you know is what the referee wrote to you. Acceptance. Yogi Berra, who was a baseball player, who's famous for strange sayings, said, it ain't over till it's over. Okay? In other words, unless, he didn't mean this, but unless you get a letter saying, we will publish your paper, we are happy to publish this paper, you are not done. What should you do when you get the letter? Celebrate. My wife had a deal with me that whenever I got a paper in a very top journal, I would get a new silk tie. Okay? And so I have various ties. Like I just got one. I have a baseball tie. I have a paper on baseball coming out in the AAR. And I got a really nice tie. That's my baseball tie. I had a suicide tie. The tie got my suicide paper, and so on and so forth. Okay? Yeah, it's just a sort of jokey way of rewarding. Put it on your CV immediately. Forthcoming. Don't think about the winner's curse. You publish it in the journal and say, oh my God, that's the first place I submitted it, and they published it. I should be shot higher. That's the winner's curse. Don't think that way. You can drive yourself nuts. I have a paper which was published in Economic Inquiry. We were talking about that journal, which is not a great journal. And it was the first place I sent it. And it was accepted very nicely. And I said to myself, should I worry about having not tried hard? Nah, not worth it. You can drive yourself nuts. Don't do it. Here's the question you ask. When to pull the plug? Pull the plug on life support means throw the paper away. I have thrown away 5 papers in my career. It's very sad. I hate to see it. I say when you've tried all reasonable journals, okay? The problem is, what's a reasonable journal? Or when you're down to journals that aren't decent but are indecent journals, things you'd be embarrassed to publish in. Are there journals you'd be embarrassed to publish in? There ought to be. And yet in a number of institutions, all they do is count. Is it a publication in a refereed journal? I know this for sure. It's an institution I was associated with for 6 years, which had a criterion. Is it a refereed journal somehow? You know about this, I know. Okay? Which of course gives tremendous incentives to publish in really bad journals. At some point you have to ask yourself the economic question. What's the gain and what's the extra cost? Now, we're publishing this paper in this low-level journal help you more than the time you're spending doing that could be used on something else. There's no answer to your question, in other words. But I know in my own case, a couple of times I've had to kill papers because I get sick of it. It also depends on where you are in your career. At this stage of my life, on the one hand, my time isn't worth very much. On the other hand, the benefits of publishing another paper in a low-level place ain't so great either. For you, the opportunity cost is tremendous of giving up or not doing something. On the other hand, the benefits are tremendous too. So both for you, they're all high. For me, they're both low. That doesn't tell us where the curves cross, does it? So you have to ask yourself, in this case, what can you do with your time? How valuable is the next journal to which I'm going to send this? All right, I want to spend much of the rest of the time talking about refereeing and some advice on refereeing. Timing pretty good. Should you referee if you're a young person? How many of you have refereed papers ever? Anybody? What journals? Don't be embarrassed. I mean, the Geneva papers on listed insurance? Very good. EJ, good for you, okay? Did you contribute money or did you take the money, by the way? Okay, they have a deal at the EJ, they stopped paying. They used to pay you £25, or you could make a contribution to charities like Oxfam. I thought it was wonderful, by the way. I tried to get the American Economic Review to do it, and they said it's too much trouble. It really annoyed me. It's not right. Okay, anybody else? Journals? Should you referee for a journal, yes or no? Well, yes. You get experience. It's, you may have learned something, reading a paper really seriously. You learn something. Also, you develop a good habit. I hate to see young people saying, I can't referee the paper. Because it's a habit. It's part of being a member of this society, society of economists. The con is that your time is too valuable. That's nonsense. Your time isn't that valuable. Don't kid yourself. Okay? Spend less time on holiday and do this instead. I used to tell myself that refereeing was nighttime work. It's what I did at night and I couldn't do my own work. And that's not a bad way of thinking about it. It's a low opportunity cost time. You don't know enough about the topic. Look, the editor wouldn't have asked you to referee if she didn't think you know enough about it. So the excuses, I don't know enough about it, that's a lousy excuse also. That doesn't make it. You've refereed the paper before. In the American Constitution, there is a clause which says no double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime twice under Anglo-Saxon law. Okay? Similarly for refereeing, if you've refereed a paper before, you shouldn't referee it again. Absolutely not. People do all the time, as you probably saw today, damn it. Okay? But they shouldn't. Or if the paper is in direct conflict with a paper of your own, so you might be seen as being negative simply to protect your own interests. That's another reason. That's more subtle. I feel pretty strongly about that. In other words, you have to be knowledgeable but dispassionate. Another thing, if you're going to referee a paper or not referee it, say yes or no immediately about the task. These days, the journals are really good. They'll say, will you referee the paper? Click this to say yes, click that to say no. And so it's almost costless for you to refuse to do it. Yeah?
What about personal interests, like the author is a good friend or your boss or whatever?
Boss, I would say don't do it. Friend? Look, it's anonymous. Your refereeing is anonymous, right? And I hope you can treat your friends dispassionately. The paper we just got rejected, I'm sorry to keep on coming back to it, but it's so appropriate in this context, right? The editor of the journal is one of probably my 4 or 5 closest friends in the profession. He had no problem turning down my paper, damn it. And I would have no, I once refereed the equivalent of the DFJ in the U.S., Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. I was on the board of that in economics. And I was asked to referee a funding proposal by the man whom I view as my mentor, a labor economist named H. Greg Lewis. Okay? And I said no. Another time I did one by Jacob Mincer. Is that name familiar? Yeah. And I said no on that too. Okay? I mean, you've got to divorce yourself and say, what is the intellectual content? So I see no problem with doing that. And the best of all, it's anonymous. They don't know it's going to be you. So if you're worried about retribution, no problem. Let's cable lunch, Lisa. No, but we just didn't move this enough. Okay. Okay. So, say yes or no about doing it immediately. How long should you spend refereeing? How much time? It depends on how long the paper is, how difficult the paper is, and how used you are to refereeing in the topic. The way I do it, I think is a good way. Somebody else I was talking to, much junior, said she did the same thing. A young assistant professor at Montreal. I go over the paper once. For my general reaction, I read it. Okay? Then I go over it again for details, reactions, and problems. And never these 2 readings on the same day. In other words, I let it sort of percolate to myself and think about it. How much time? I spend in total 4 or 5 hours refereeing a paper. I've been doing a lot of them over the years, so I'm probably quicker than you are. But if you spend, there's a guy I know who's a senior professor at another university in Texas. I said, how much time do you spend refereeing? He said, about 40 hours on a paper. I said, you obviously have nothing else to do with your time. I mean, it's ridiculous. It ain't worth it. Okay? Your job is not to write the paper. Your job is to read it and comment on it. Okay? So maybe 8 hours in total for a young person, but never more than that. A good referee report should tell the editor what you think, yes or no, and why. Don't write the same thing to the editor that you write to the authors. Too often in my journal, I'll get a letter that's just a repeat of the first part of what he's writing to the authors. I want you to be frank. If you think this paper is nonsense, say so. If it's not publishable anywhere, say so. Should you make different recommendations for different journals? Yeah. The AER has higher standards than the Journal of, I don't know, Labor Research. One you've never heard of, probably. I hope. Again, yes. Main thing is, though, saying a paper is correct is not the issue. Half the papers that I get are correct. Are they important? Are they original? Will they inspire a lot of additional work and thought? Your job in writing to the editor is to say if this is important. That's the crucial thing. Not that it's correct. On this letter, be frank. Be tough, but fair. To the author, I always write in the first paragraph, I summarize the paper. What it was about, what it did, what's novel. That way I show the author that I understood what she did. And that's what gives me a bona fides for writing more. Then I have a general section, the good things and the bad things, and then specific section. Be nice in the language. You can be critical, but don't be mean or nasty. The Quarterly Journal of Economics, in the late 1970s, the editor had them include a thing in the journal saying, and their letters to the referees saying, be kind, it will shine a light in a cruel world. Okay? I really like that line. Okay? And so be kind, fair but kind, and never nasty. I mean, it's tough enough business as you saw on being nasty. Don't try to guess who the authors are. These days, papers that are assigned to you are double blind, right? You don't know who wrote it in most cases. Not always. Some journals will tell you. Don't try to guess the author's identity. When you're done, if you want to, enter the title, Google it, and you can find out who wrote the paper. You will be very surprised. Despite what you think, evidence on this, you can't tell who wrote the paper. Just don't know. Similarly, you can't tell who refereed your papers. It's very hard to figure out, and you shouldn't be trying. Here's a few letters examples. Here's the bottom line, a letter to the editor, a third-level journal. Overall, this is a very big paper. I'd recommend against publication. Very straightforward. Don't publish this. It doesn't get more explicit than that. I try to be nice. There's one little thing here. A very little bit is interesting. One interesting thing could be, but they didn't do it. This is a letter to the editor saying you'd be crazy to publish this. Here's a fairly positive letter to the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I have somewhat mixed feelings. It's exactly the kind of work that should be done, but it's a fairly narrow issue. It's a nice piece, but it may not be as a widespread intellectual use as one hopes. Okay. Blah, 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 blah. My reservation is that this is a fairly narrow issue. This is nasty. I don't know why I did this. Although I realize that hasn't precluded you from publishing papers that at least is narrow. So maybe I'm being too mean. But, you know, this is a sort of a yes and no letter. And in fact, they rejected the paper because I was the happiest referee. There were 3 others who didn't like it. It's a really good paper. Here are some summary paragraphs. Here's the first paragraph, blah, 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 blah. No point in going on about that. That's a summary paragraph. Here is a worthless report I got from a referee. Not our paper. This is a different worthless report. Let's look at this last paragraph. I think the paper could benefit from clearer structure and a convincing answer. I mean, this is absolutely useless specifically. That's the last one. Let me say one thing about the letters that you will get as an author and the referee report. So I rejected the paper last week from my journal. I had 2 referee reports. No, one very negative referee report, and I didn't like the paper either. I said we're not going to be able to publish this. The guy wrote back the same day and said, look, I can very easily revise the paper in light of the specific comments that the referee made. And what did I write to him? I said, look, the problem isn't the specifics. The problem is, while this is mostly correct or correctable, it's not sufficiently general that I want to publish it. More and more than I can count, people will tell me they rejected my paper, and I don't know why. The referees liked it. Nobody cares if the referees liked it or not in the letters that you get. It's what the referee tells the editor and what the editor thinks. So don't assume from a referee report that just because it's not nasty, that your paper was beloved by all. It wasn't. All right, that's the bottom line. Any questions on any of these things or related things that I didn't cover, I'm happy to talk about. Or I'll be around all this week and next. You can come and pester me in my office upstairs in the Sonderforschungsbereich. Wirtschaftstheorie 2? Is that it? It's next to mine. All right, questions, comments, thoughts? This is sort of advice to the lovelorn, as it were, in economics. Yes? When I do what? That book was there, so it's after. He had other stuff as well. Yeah, no, it's after. It's after. Yeah.
So how do you deal with referee reports when you have to revise? You promised people this time.
My feeling is, well, these days you have to write in response to a referee report. You have to write a detail of how I dealt with them. If I think it made any sense at all, I will do it. Okay. If I think it is just wrong, I will say this is wrong. If I think it's unimportant or not very important and a lot of work, I will say this is not that important and it's a lot of work, I don't want to do it. If it's important and a lot of work, I will do it. Okay? I think, for example, about this baseball paper that I mentioned. We had 4 referee reports. 2 of them were minor. The third person basically wanted, he wanted a lot more stuff on baseball, which I said, no, it's just irrelevant. The guy was a baseball economist, God forbid, whatever that is. Okay? And we just said to the editor, look, we could do all this, and it just really, it's not economic, it doesn't matter. The 4th referee, bless his heart, said, look, you sort of made some comments about this, but you haven't really thought about how the phenomenon might alter the agent's behavior. We didn't really know what he was talking about, but it got us thinking. And we did a whole different section, a huge amount of work, with one of the prettiest pictures you'll ever see, which made the paper, basically it added another, there had been 2 major ideas. This illustrated a 3rd major idea. So it was a huge amount of work, but the idea seemed so original that it's worth doing. So you've got to weigh all these things. So no, if they say pink polka dots and it's trivial to do, I probably would do it. If they say pink polka dots and I have to paint the sky myself, no. Okay, there's the answer on that analogy. Okay?
Well, then I have another question.
Sure, go ahead. Your colleagues won't talk, it's your turn.
So what about the claim that people from Europe have a heart attack?
I didn't have that in this lecture, but I have that as part of a paper I gave at solely presidential talk. It's in the Jolly of 2002 rather. So I got data for 3 American journals and 3 European journals. And I identified the authors as to whether they were European data or American data, okay? This is what you're asking about. That is, people say European data are harder to get published in top journals. Is that it? Okay, well I didn't have it. That's hard to say. Those are pretty collinear, right? The source of the data and the source of the author. I couldn't do them both. I did the source of the data. In terms of the paper's subsequent referees, if it were the case that we were undervaluing European data, you'd think those papers would get cited more, right? Because they're more valuable, conditional on being in a journal. In fact, the papers had the same citation rates wherever the data was from, conditional on being in the same journal. So I don't think that's there. I think part of the problem is Europeans will write the case of, I don't know, Slovakia or something. In a sense, you undersell yourself. Again, it's important to stress that the European data are just the ones you know. A journal is getting a general point. I think, quite frankly, this is a personal prejudice, that top journals are much too much American data oriented. We build a general theory, we tested, unquote, in American data. That's not a test, that's one observation. So, stress that point, that you're doing your idea on a different set of data than the usual one you use. It's a new idea, and it happens to be German rather than American. There's nothing special about that. Okay, so I think the comment that I hear all the time from my European friends is wrong, but partly it's right is because people don't do enough to make clear about what they're doing is general. Also, don't go away at the end of the talk. I got to take your picture. There's a very strange reason. This has nothing to do with this talk. 1 second, Michael. I'm doing a blog entry about changing social norms. Okay? And no, you are. You are. Let me tell you why. It's really cool. I've been coming to Europe since 1958. And until this time, I've never seen a European walking around in sandals without socks. And suddenly, this time in Germany, people have sandals without socks, the way Americans do. This is a changed social norm. I need a picture from my website. I won't even take your face. Don't get no here. Push your feet. If I can stand up right now, there we go. Don't go away. We'll answer Michael's question. No, you got to stand up. Hold on. There we go.
I'm not German.
Oh, where are you from? That's okay. Same difference. I say Northern European. It's the same difference. Michael, the other question.
That's Roland Strauss. He's one of our most published microeconomic economics was published this year by faculty.
Okay, well, and he also wearing swimming sandals? Thank you. You made my day.
Dutch writers on the same one as the Germans.
Well, Well, the other social norm I have on this is the picture on the front page of the third section of Tagesspiegel today, which you'd see in Berlin, but never in an American newspaper. I mentioned this to you. Check it out. All right, other questions?
I have a question in general. This is, wonderful talk. I think a lot of people have gotten a lot out of it. Given your experience, do you think that we have too many journals now and we're publishing too much? Given that we all have limited attention and we only read maybe the top 5 or top 10 journals anyway, is the social value of getting it in somewhere as high as the private value?
Well, there are two arguments. One thing is to separate that out from the value of the web. I mean, everything circulates like crazy beforehand. But I don't know the answer to that. My own opinion is, I believe in the market. If what you say, you haven't said it, if you felt that there were too many, then the market presumably would not be expanding to fill this. Okay? So certainly from a market-based point of view, the private gains, both from the demander, that's me, and the supplier, have got to justify, which they seem to. Okay, so the answer there is no. The overall question, should there be this many journals? I think you're asking a question, should people at the Fachhochschule Rügen, which I don't think exists, is there a Fachhochschule in Rügen? Probably not, okay? Should the economists at the Fachhochschule Rügen be required to publish in academic journals? Because that's where the demands are coming from, right? It's coming from people at every place you can imagine. And the question there is, I don't know, that's a much broader question than what you're asking. But there's a market test, there's no question. The market suggests it should be going on. So the answer is yes. I'm not bothered by that. I don't know if you expected that or not. Did you? Okay. All right. I'm not so sure. I mean, it's a very Chicago-y answer. On the other hand, I am bothered because as more and more places have more and more journals, there's more and more to referee, which I do less and less of because I refuse to do it for most journals. And more places, when it comes time to promote somebody, give them a fancier position, they ask outsiders for letters, which is a tremendous burden on the profession. It's a burden which falls extremely heavily on more senior people and more visible people. And there's much more of that going on now. It used to be only a very few schools that asked for letters. In Germany, this doesn't. No, you do the same thing when you want to appoint somebody, right? Okay. And every school does that now. It used to be you promote your assistant, and life is very easy, right? Not anymore. So this poses a burden on the profession. Does it have a social value? I don't know. Probably. Maybe. Other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.